We'll move on to our first plenary talk. We're delighted to welcome Thom Scott-Phillips to the event. Thom is a cognitive scientist based at the Institute for Logic, Cognition, Language and Information at the University of the Basque Country. His work is especially focused on language and communication, and his book, Speaking Our Minds, argues that intention reading or mind reading has been primary to the evolution of human communication. He's published widely and given public talks for a range of organisations, including TEDx. And his talk today is entitled The Roots of Grammar in Relevance. So without further ado, we will pass the floor over to Thom.
I'm sorry, I forgot to unmic myself before I started sharing my screen, and that confused me. There we go. You can hear me now, I assume.
We can hear you, and we can.
Yeah, and you can now see my slides, I think. Yeah, super. Okay. Let me just put that in the right place. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you might be in the world. And thank you to Kate and Ryoko for not simply organising this event, but for the Relevance Researchers Network over the past couple of years. Kate is being a little bit modest when she says it was, it was a good thing. It's helpful during the pandemic. It was, it's great. It's a great service to be able to to put everybody together in the first place and to keep the community together through the pandemic. And I'm sure I speak for many people, very happy that you did so and delighted to be speaking at this first conference or workshop. In this talk, I'm going to try and persuade you that something that seems like an obvious truism about language may not be quite so straightforward. Essentially, I want to try and persuade you that grammar may not be entirely what it might first appear to be, or grammaticality and acceptability as notions closely associated with grammar. And I'm going to try and rethink them from a relevance perspective. So let me start with basic empirical phenomenon, which is that people have pretty clear intuitions about what sort of sentences feel right in their language. And there's a great deal of agreement between speakers about about which sentences are acceptable and which ones are not. So utterly trivial example, John said to Mary that he likes doing linguistics, is perfectly fine in English. The sentence that follows, to he likes that linguistics, John Mary doing said, is utterly, that's word salad, doesn't mean anything. But it's not just word salad that is unacceptable. What did Peter eat ravioli with is perfectly fine. What did Peter eat ravioli and is obviously not fine. Obviously not fine if you're a speaker of English, a competent speaker of English. Further examples of sentences that have a flavor of being close to something that's acceptable, but which are equally, obviously unacceptable. Mary ate the bread that I baked a cake. John is very tall, doesn't he? Now, what's going on here? I mean, as I say, everybody shares this pretty clear intuition about what's acceptable and what's not. I'm going to quote Chomsky, but could quote many, many other people by saying the speaker has an intuitive sense of grammaticalness. And this is an idea that lies behind the empirical basis of a great deal of linguistic theory, most obviously generative theory, but actually, a lot of linguistic theory of many different schools of thought. This intuitive notion of grammaticalness or grammaticality, and that in some way generates these intuitions of acceptability. As I say, I'm going to question whether what's really going on here is an intuitive sense of grammaticality. I think actually it's an intuitive sense of potential relevance. Just to elaborate on the empirical phenomenon a little bit more, this is a table from a very useful paper published a couple of years ago, making clear that acceptability and grammaticality are not the same sort of thing. So we have sentences which we've just seen, which are acceptable and grammatical, and sentences which are unacceptable and ungrammatical, and those examples are very easy to generate. But there are examples that are acceptable but ungrammatical and vice versa. So more people have been to Russia than I have. If you ask people to make quick decisions about whether this is acceptable or not, as I say, especially if they're quick decisions, snap judgments, people will tend to say this is acceptable. But then a little bit closer reflection, you will see that this does not quite accord with the grammar of English and is ungrammatical in some technical sense. And then we have grammatical and unacceptable sentences. dogs, dogs, dog, dog, dogs. Many other examples could be generated here. Ask people if this is acceptable and they will give you a blank stare. They will, what on earth are you talking about? Because it's very hard to parse what this could possibly mean. Just to help you, the dogs, the 3 words with the plural, they are nouns. The 2 without a plural are verbs. And so it's if you swap them for other nouns and verbs, you could say dogs catch chase like tomatoes. So the dogs that are chased by cats are the dogs that like tomatoes. So going back to the original sentence, the dogs that are dogged by dogs are the dogs that dog dogs. It's grammatical, but it's unacceptable. Very, very hard to pass. And the classical idea, as I suggested earlier, is we have an intuitive sense of grammaticality. And then acceptability deviates from grammaticality for reasons to do with, sometimes called performance-related factors, memory constraints, stylistic aspects of speech, poetics, and so on. That's the intuitive idea. I'd like to suggest that while those factors are clearly all playing a role, at root, what's really going on is that acceptability derives from considerations of relevance in communication, or potential, possible, plausible relevance in communication. I'm writing a manuscript on this at the moment. It's almost complete, but it's not complete. And I mean it when I say that feedback is very much welcome, whether it's in the Q&A now, whether it's Twitter, email. Please do get in touch if you have thoughts, reflections. If you want to tell me I'm wrong, I want to hear about it. Okay, and there's 3 parts to the talk. I'm first going to talk about communications and conventions as means of how I think about linguistic communication. Obviously, I won't spend quite so long on communication, given that this is a relevance theory workshop and my approach to communication is absolutely a relevance theoretic one. Having talked about that, I'll get to the meat of the idea about understanding acceptability, and then I'll zoom out from acceptability to the broader phenomenon of grammar itself. Okay, so communication and conventions. As I say, I'm not going to spend too long, certainly not for this audience, talking a great deal about relevance theory. I assume a lot of common ground here, but just to summarize key ideas I'm going to lean on. Take it that communication is ostensive and a much broader phenomenon than language use. So ostensive communication is a large family of different ways of expressing ourselves, of which language use is a very important, the most important particular instance. And ostensive I take to mean making manifest an informative intention in particular. So when we communicate, we reveal to our audience what we want to do to their mind, in effect. And our audiences can choose whether to satisfy that informative intention. They can recognize what we want to do to their minds. They don't have to accept it, of course. They may not believe us, they may not trust us, or all sorts of reasons why they may not accept it. But we reveal our intentions with respect to others' minds. And obviously, those of you who know philosophy of language and the history will see the origins of that idea in Paul Grice's work. And then audience comprehension is governed by presumptions of relevance, more specifically presumptions of optimal relevance. So that is to say that the stimulus that's produced, whether it's a linguistic utterance or otherwise, is the most relevant one that the communicator could have produced, given their goals, what they want to do to the audience's mind, and the means that they have available to them. And relevance, I'm sure everybody knows, but just to create the common ground, a trade-off between cognitive effort that the audience has to use to comprehend the stimulus and the cognitive effects that the stimulus produces for them. Audiences assume that ostensive stimuli optimize this trade-off. So that's the communication side. I'm going to spend longer on the convention side of things. Many people say that languages are sets of conventions. That seems to be almost a truism for many people. But it seems to me when I look at various literatures, people say that, but they don't often spell out what they mean either by communication or by convention. By communication, I'm going to use relevance theory, as I say, and now I'm going to elaborate how I suggest it's useful to think about convention and marry the two together. When people do talk about convention, I often go down the path of suggesting conventions should be characterized in terms of particular properties they might have, most obviously that they be arbitrary. And indeed, linguistic items are often said to be arbitrary. If you go that way, I'm not going to go into details now, but I feel you often end up in a lot of slippery and difficult places. And its better starting point is to think of conventions in a functional way as commonly known solutions to recurrent coordination problems. Take the obvious example. A recurrent coordination problem is that many people want to drive along the road, often in opposite directions to one another. So you have a coordination problem that need to pass each other in a safe manner. It's a coordination problem, it's recurrent, it happens all the time. And there is a commonly known solution, which is that in the UK, we all drive on the left, and that commonly known solution is different. In other parts of the world, we drive on the right, in Hungary and Spain, for instance. In ostensive communication, there is also a recurrent coordination problem, and that is convergence on the informative intention. Or you could say, I'm going to use convergence on the informative intention. That's a coordination problem. Both communicator and audience are invested in succeeding at that, and it's recurrent. It happens all the time. And there are commonly known, I'm going to suggest there are commonly known solutions. In particular, this broader recurrent coordination problem, convergence on the communicator's informative intention, can be subdivided into all sorts of sub-problems, and they have they're commonly known solutions, which we're going to call conventions. So a trivial example, a child wants a ball. That divides into many recurring sub-problems. The child has a desire, that desire is transitive, it has the child as an agent, it has the ball as a patient. And it seems plain to me that languages are replete with items that help resolve precisely these sorts of recurrent sub-problems. There are, I want to say thousands, but actually I should perhaps say tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of sub-problems that could exist in ostensive communication, and for which languages, the various languages of the world, have developed particular items to help resolve those particular sub-problems. In English, we have verbs like want, we have transitive construction. These sorts of things are obviously super common across languages, perhaps universal. Many other such items may not be universal, but still do occur in different various languages. I think it's useful to call these items constructions, and they can exist at all levels of linguistic analysis, not just at the surface level of the word or the idiom, but much greater levels of abstraction. And this is an idea that's developed in an enormous literature called construction grammar, has certain other commitments with respect to explaining languages, which I don't think we necessarily need to buy into in a strong form. But I do find that construction grammar provides a very useful nomenclature, system of characterizing, describing languages, all sorts of different levels of abstraction. Just to elaborate take a table here inspired by Adele Goldberg's summary of constructionist approaches. Constructions can be individual words, Iran, another, banana, add as many as you wish. Constructions can be partially filled words, so pre and then a noun, or verb and then a gerund form, prefigure, sleeping. Constructions can be idioms, which can be completely filled. Give the devil his due, going great guns. They can be partially filled idioms, jog somebody's memory, someone's for the asking. And they can be minimally filled idioms, the X or the Y, and you can fill in X and Y in all sorts of different ways. The more you think about it, the less you understand. Of course, what you use to fill in is itself a construction. So that's the constructions operating at many levels of analysis. A ditransitive construction, which takes a subject, a verb, and then two objects. He gave her a fish taco, he baked her a muffin. You can, of course, have a transitive construction too. A passive construction, a subject, an auxiliary, past participle, and then perhaps a preposition at the end. The armadillo was hit by a car. Now that's the construction. As I say, this idea is elaborated in enormous detail in various different ways in the construction grammar literature. What you often don't see in that literature, however, is the idea that constructions, so understood as conventions for doing ostensive communication, which is how I would like to characterize them, exist also beyond language use. So we might think of the pointing construction, which comes in many different forms. We might think of different forms of notation, such as in mathematics. We could think of the power construction, 2 to the 7, e to the I pi, or the square root construction. And we could also think of notation in something like chess. We have castle kingside has certain forms, very much like a word. Rook to g6 with check. Again, very much, or an idiom, word or an idiom. It's a construction that can be plugged in to ostensive communication as we see fit. So we have a whole enormous range, really, I think, cover, not just language use, but all sorts of expressive and communicative domains. What all these things have in common is that they are conventions for doing ostensive communication. We can be ostensive in all sorts of ways, and we can be ostensive in highly creative and ad hoc ways, pantomime with our body. But of course, a great deal of the time we are using culturally evolved tools, I would call them conventions, which allow us to do ostensive communication more effectively than we otherwise would. What linguistic constructions in particular have in common? So these ones here, what differentiate they share in common? Let me go back. What they share in common is that they are all conventions for ostensive communication. Linguistic constructions have a particular quality, which is that they have a very high degree of mutual interdependence. So there are exceptions, of course, idioms being the obvious example, but for the most part, all the linguistic conventions, in order to perform their particular subfunction within ostensive communication, they are relying on other conventions also performing their subfunction at the same time, concurrently. So the ditransitive construction can only perform its particular subfunction, which is to provide a frame for description of ditransitive actions, if there are suitable objects to fill the particular slots. There's a high degree of mutual interdependence. And what they're doing is they're making manifest different aspects of the communicator's informative intention. So let me sum up this idea that communications and conventions can go hand in hand by going to the webcomic XKCD. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but those of you that aren't, please check it out. It's very funny and very insightful about the world. It's technology, humor, science, love, all sorts of interesting themes. One comic on the nature of linguistic communication. There's several parts to the comic, but in the middle of it, elaborating what I think I'm trying to say now in a more humorous and deep way, in a way. One character says to another, "We're these unbelievably complicated brains drifting through a void, trying in vain to connect with one another by blindly flinging out words into the darkness." And I think that's what's going on. We are putting these constructions together and trying, in an attempt to make them useful for our audience. And our audience is good of them. They presume that what we are doing is optimally relevant. But of course, audiences are all different to one another. So the character continues, every choice of phrasing and spelling and tone and timing carries countless signals and context and subtext and more. And every listener interprets these signals in their own way. So the conclusion of this short monologue from this character is that language is not a formal system. Language is glorious chaos. We are throwing these conventions out there, trying to make them work for the challenging task of ostensive communication. The remarkable thing, of course, is that it does work most of the time. And what I'd like to suggest is it works because of a combination of two particular things. One is human-specific cognitive capacities for engaging in ostensive communication, elaborated, I think in their most cognitively plausible form in relevance theory. And on the other side, whole rich sets of conventions, which are commonly known solutions to the recurrent subproblems entailed by ostensive communication. I think constructionist approaches to grammar provide an extremely productive means with which to describe these conventions and the relationships that they have to one another. And now in the next part of the talk, I'm going to suggest, as I move towards the idea of explaining acceptability, I'm going to suggest that acceptability arises when these two parts of what is going on in communication exhibit a tension, when it's hard to reconcile these two aspects of the problem. So to cut to the main claim, to move to the second part of the talk and to cut to the main claim. Unacceptable sentences, I suggest, are those where the presumption of optimal relevance, which governs interpretation, simply cannot be met. There are sentences in the world where we presume they are going to be optimally relevant, but they cannot possibly be met. And the reason they cannot be met is the constructions that are common knowledge within a population don't license any reading that could meet the presumption of optimal relevance. So let me work through a few simple examples to elaborate that idea. Peter speaks fluently French. So Peter speaks French fluently is perfectly acceptable in English, but Peter speaks fluently French is not, even though the meaning seems clear. So what's the problem? Well, I'd like to suggest that given that this is an unconventional use of the constructions that are at play, common knowledge in English, that means that there is additional cognitive effort required, given that you're not tapping into the common body of knowledge. Additional cognitive effort is required, but having invested as a hypothesized audience, investing the cognitive effort, I don't get any additional cognitive effect for that additional cognitive effort. What that means is that this cannot possibly be an optimally relevant sentence, which means in turn, I suggest that that's what triggers the intuition that this is not acceptable. The key point here is that the non-accordance with grammar, the unconventional use, is an input into considerations of optimal relevance. To put that point in slightly different words, being conventional is simply usually the optimally relevant thing to do. And sometimes, of course, that's violated. And when it does, we need additional cognitive effects to compensate. And when we don't get them, then we conclude it's not optimally relevant and hence unacceptable. Or even to simplify things even further into a three-word slogan, conventions minimize effort. And by minimizing effort, they converge on optimal relevance or help us converge on optimal relevance. Let me work through another example now, which really, I think, highlights the importance of the ostensive character of human communication. Go back to that dogs, dogs, dogs example. Now, if we take a code model approach to linguistic communication, then a sentence like this would appear to be, in some sense, optimal or highly efficient. It's hard to see how the supposed intended meaning could be more efficiently expressed given the grammar of English. So this should be perfectly acceptable, but in fact it's not. So why not? Well, I'd like to suggest that there is a near impossibility of identifying the constructions because of the fact that the same term is being used both as a noun and a verb, and it makes it very hard to see what's going on. That near impossibility means that there are no cognitive effects, or virtually no cognitive effects, certainly none associated with the communicator's particular informative intention. Given that there are no cognitive effects, that means that the sentence cannot be optimally relevant. And given that it can't be optimally relevant, therefore it's judged as unacceptable. You don't get that, of course, if you take a code model approach to linguistic communication. Here's a third class of examples. So examples which are not technically, not in some characterizations of what grammar might be. You get examples which do not accord with the grammar of a language, which do seem to have an air of acceptability, or at least quasi-acceptability to them. Creative uses of language. Discussed at some length in Adele Goldberg's recent book, Explain Me This, and the title is a very clever title, really. Explain Me This. Or He Vanished the Rabbit. As I say, they seem to not quite accord with English grammar, but they seem to be acceptable, at least to some degree. Why should that be so? Well, these are, again, unconventional uses of the constructions of English, which means that they entail additional cognitive effort. But in this case, there is some plausible additional cognitive effect. These expressions capture something of perhaps some urgency or surprise or even pleasure in what's going on, in describing what's going on. You might imagine a small child. He vanished the rabbit. Expressing some, as I say, some pleasant surprise at what's going on, even though it's unconventional. And given that, although there's additional cognitive effort, there is also some plausible additional cognitive effort. That means it's plausible that this is optimally relevant for a particular context, for a particular speaker and audience. And given that it can be plausibly relevant, plausibly optimally relevant, excuse me, then it can be judged as acceptable, or at least plausibly acceptable. Let me last of all move on to some of those examples. I think these are particularly revealing examples, and I'm going to move on now to saying a bit more about why optimal relevance, considerations of intuitions of optimal relevance should trigger, a particular type of intuition. And these sentences, I think, have a certain character, a kind of wait, what's going, they seem on first glance to be, on a first instance, that's a sentence in English. And then you look a bit more closely, you go, wait, something doesn't add up here. Something's not right. What did Peter eat ravioli and? Mary ate the bread that I baked a cake. John is very tall, doesn't he? To quote some commentary on these sentences from some others known to many people in this workshop. So these sentences like this seem in some way bad. I think that's a very interesting, and it's a great word to use to describe examples like this. So something is not right. All the words are common and the intended message is clear enough, but the sentence as a whole is odd. I think these are a good choice of words. I say bad, odd. And it comes from Neil Smith and Nick Allett's, well, originally Neil Smith's book, now it's third edition with Nick Allett, their book on Chomsky. I've added the italics because I think these are very revealing choices of words and I agree with them. And examples like those at the bottom of the screen, they seem different in character. They don't have that kind of, wait, what that, I don't quite, quality to them. I think sentences like these ones have more in common with phenomena which are not in a linguistic domain, but in other domains. So here's an example. Physical objects. Sometimes these are called paradox illusions. They look like physical objects. That's what they first appear to be. And then you look more closely and you go, wait, hold on. And you try and work out what's going on and something doesn't add up. Something is not right about what's going on here. That looks like a staircase, but then, oh, wait, I look more closely and it doesn't accord with what I expect of staircases. Let me give you a third example. I was talking to my partner recently about these sentences of this kind. And I said, what, how do these sentences feel to you? And she said, those sentences they're like the cows. And I looked at her, I was like, cows? What cows? And she said, there's a YouTube video of cows, which are just like that sentence. And she opened up this video, and I won't play the whole video because it has an awful backing music track. I've got a screenshot here. And it's cows in a field, but all the cows have been morphed in certain ways. And she said in particular, this cow, this one in the middle, she said that cow is like the sentence, John is very tall, doesn't he? And it appears as a cow on first instance, but then you look more closely and something is not right about this. Something's not right about its legs. Ditto, frankly, for all the others. And if you watch the video, if you want, all sorts of bizarre instances. What I'm suggesting is there's something profoundly in common with all these examples. The sentences, the physical objects, the animals, they all appear to present as a certain type of thing. And then when you look a bit more closely, they disconfirm expectations about those things. Core cognitive processes, I take to be their signature quality that they embody certain presumptions about the world. It's an idea explored in great detail in the literature on cognitive development, in particular by people like Liz Spelke and Susan Carey at Harvard. Looking at infants, and what they show is that phenomena that are perceived to be objects, infants and also adults, simply presume or they treat those objects as having certain qualities. They are physically cohesive, they are bonded, they are rigid, you cannot act on them at a distance. And what they find, as I say, both in infants very early on in life and in adults, that when those expectations are violated, that causes cognitive surprise or confusion. It generates that sense of, wait, what that is meant to be an object, and now it's been acted on at a distance. Something is not right. Okay. There is also a growing literature on what's sometimes called folk biology. I'd rather call it core biology, exploring the same idea in the domain of biology, and in particular expectations about, for example, animals. Many animals are expected to have 4 legs of a certain kind, and in particular expected to have viable mechanics. And then they present as animals, and then they actually don't have some of the qualities expected of them. And that again causes that cognitive surprise, those violations of expectations. I'd like to suggest that one way to understand the central idea of relevance theory, the communicative principle of relevance, is in the same terms. That phenomena that are perceived as ostensive, that appear in the world as having an ostensive character, they are simply presumed to be optimally relevant. And when they are not optimally relevant, that causes that same sense of cognitive surprise, that same sense of cognitive confusion. And what I'd like to suggest is that sentences like these are precisely the sort of sentences that trigger that sense of cognitive surprise, something that's roughly equivalent to what happens when we see an object that violates expectations, or something that appears as an object but violates what we expect objects to be like. Now, why should sentences like these have this particular quality of violating our expectations of optimal relevance? I need to go back here to the point I made earlier about the nature of linguistic conventions, about the constructions that collectively comprise a given language. They have a very high degree. It's what characterizes them as linguistic in the first place. They have a very high degree of mutual interdependence. The constructions of a language cannot perform their various subfunctions unless other constructions are also performing their subfunctions. And what happens in the sentences like these is that different constructions are violating each other. And by doing so, they're in tension with the presumptions of optimal relevance that govern interpretation we expect to be satisfied when we experience ostensive stimuli in the world. So it's this tension between, on the one hand, the presumptions of optimal relevance that govern interpretation, on the other hand, the structure, the high mutual interdependence of conventions. When there is a tension between those things, you generate that sense of, in some sense, bad, there's something odd about sentences of this particular kind. So to sum all that up, violations of embodied presumptions about the world cause cognitive surprise across multiple different domains, whether that's in the domain of object perception, whether that's in the domain of folk biology, core biology, or whether that's in the domain of ostensive stimuli. Okay, so that's one summary. I could maybe zoom out a bit more even and contrast this approach to explaining acceptability with what I might call a more classical approach, a more intuitive approach to explaining or understanding what's going on with acceptability. We can ask two questions about these two different approaches. So one is, what is the core cognitive competence that humans appear to have that explains what's going on? What sometimes in some parts, in generative approaches to language, sometimes called biological endowment, a perfectly good term. I prefer core cognitive competence, but I take them to be equivalent. Well, on one approach, there is some core cognitive competence in grammar, and that gives you intuitions of grammaticality. I'm suggesting that there is an alternative way to frame things, is that there is a core cognitive competence in ostensive communication. And what I've tried to describe so far is how that can generate intuitions of acceptability. So where does and the second question you can ask is, where does the sense of oddness come from? And it comes either non-grammaticality, violating intuitions of grammar, or it can come from non-optimal relevance, violating expectations of optimal relevance in ostensive communication. And it's worth saying, although, I've used terminology from generative approaches to language science to characterize this more classical approach, and I quoted Chomsky earlier, many people who are not generativists and might even be critical of generativist approaches, they often share the intuitive assumption that some competence with grammar is what is shaping and determining acceptability. And I want to, including many people who would call themselves constructionists. And I'm in a moment, I'm really going to contrast the difference between these two different approaches. I disagree even with those who want to disagree with the generativist approach. So that's what I think is going on with acceptability. And I'm using the word acceptability rather than grammaticality for a very good reason. I said earlier, they're not the same thing. And now I'm going to really try and contrast acceptability with grammaticality and grammar and make clear two different ways of thinking about the nature of grammar. To do that, I need to distinguish two different uses of the word. So grammar I and grammar P. So I is for individual and P is for populational. So one is individual, it's cognitive, it's behavioral, and the other is a statistical and a dynamical construct at the level of the population. So grammar I for individuals, the set of constructions that are mentally represented and used by a given individual. Sometimes you'd see a word like idiolect used to capture a similar idea. I'm going to use grammar I. Grammar P is for populational. That's the constructions that are common and widespread in a population at large, which is to say within a given set of grammar I's. As I say, one of these is a cognitive and a behavioral phenomenon. The other is a statistical phenomenon, or dynamical statistical. These are not the same thing. That we often use the word grammar and we slide between the two. And I think it's very important to keep them apart. And I'm going to do that in the next few slides. I'm going to make graphic two different ways of thinking about, about grammar and about the related notions of acceptability and grammaticality. So here's the classical approach. There is an internal grammar I. Here we go, internal grammar I. And as I say, that generates intuitions of grammaticality. At the same time, people use grammar I. Sometimes they use it for communication. It's commonly called externalization. And that gives you certain sentences. And those sentences might deviate from these intuitions for various reasons that I mentioned earlier: memory constraints, stylistic aspects of speech, and so on. And then you get the contrast between these two things is said to determine our reflective judgments of what's called, on this classical approach, acceptability. And in a great many psycholinguistic experiments, for example, you ask participants, are these sentences acceptable in your language? And the background assumption of that approach is that you're capturing some difference between this phenomenon and this phenomenon here. Now, of course, all these people using, externalizing language and communicating and interacting with one another generates a whole population, and we can look at what they're doing and then extrapolate from that all sorts of patterns. Indeed, we do it as ordinary language users. We identify patterns, but in particular, professional linguists, teachers, they specialize in identifying grammar P, the populational level phenomenon. So that sits down here. So that's the classical approach. I think it's quite an intuitive way of thinking about what's going on. And what I'm going to do now is suggest that we need to rethink some of this. I'm going to keep some parts. So I'm going to keep that on the left-hand side, there is some core cognitive competence, which generates intuitions. And over here on the right-hand side, there is also grammar at the populational level. But what's in between is quite different. So the core cognitive competence is in ostensive communication, and we use grammar I as a tool. It's a means for doing ostensive communication. That generates intuitions of acceptability, which, as I've argued so far, should be best understood as intuitions of plausible optimal relevance. And that's at the individual level. Of course, we also use language, we communicate, we externalize, and that generates, again, many individuals interacting with one another, generates many patterns, which we can observe as individuals, we can observe them as linguists, and so on. And that gives us grammar P. And I'd suggest that grammaticality is best understood as a contrast between this grammar P over here and the intuitions that we have about plausible optimal relevance as individuals. And this is quite a different picture to what went before. I'm going to put both images back in a moment, but just before I do, let me summarize what I think are the differences between these two different approaches. Three main differences. First, the core cognitive competence, or the biological endowment. Is it in some competence with grammar, qua grammar, as an internal phenomenon, or is it a core cognitive competence in ostensive communication? What is the role of accordance with grammar? So on one approach, accordance with grammar is what defines intuitions of grammaticality. On the other, accordance with grammar comes later and is a means of, doesn't come later. It's a means of being optimally relevant. And then acceptability and grammaticality. Which one is the intuition that we have, and which one is the more reflective judgment that we make sometimes when we're asked or we discuss it with others? And I'm not going to go into my suggestion right now, although it's a good topic for the Q&A about what this means for psycholinguistic method. But in any case, I think it's very important to keep these two notions apart. So there's three differences. Let me go back to the images. So that's the classical approach. The grammar is the core cognitive competence, generates intuitions of grammaticality and reflective judgments of acceptability. On the relevance-based approach, we have a core cognitive competence in ostensive communication, which generates intuitions of acceptability. And we have reflective judgments of grammaticality. So grammaticality and acceptability are in different positions in the two different approaches. Let me sum up. if I want to say one thing to take away, I want to suggest that grammar is not quite what people tend to think it is. I think the basic currency of the mind, what Sperber and Wilson called the cognitive principle of relevance, minds, optimize relevance is a very basic currency. And I think if we push that insight to its really logical conclusions, it gives us an opportunity to rethink the fundamental, the most basic notions in language science, including, what is grammar, what is grammaticality. Let me just, that's one line, but let me say a bit more about the argument I've tried to develop so far. Acceptability, I think, derives at bottom, not from considerations of accordance with grammar, but in fact from considerations of possible optimal relevance in communication. Yeah. Which means that unacceptability are those cases where presumptions of optimal relevance, which govern ordinary ostensive communication, cannot possibly be met for given this sentence. This sentence cannot meet those presumptions given the constructions that are available in a population. Following convention, according with the grammar of a language, is not what determines acceptability. It's a means of being relevant. And it's relevance that determines acceptability. And then grammars I would like to suggest, grammars in the populational sense, are best understood as the macro product of many micro moments of optimal relevance in ordinary communication. Let me finish. Last thing I'm going to say is at the beginning, I really meant it when I said I would like feedback. It's true that I have nearly finished a manuscript, but I'm definitely at this moment when I'm ready for feedback and keen to receive it. So please, it's a Q&A, far away. Tell me all the different ways in which I'm wrong. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. And on that note, I will open the floor to questions, comments, feedback. You can raise your hand. Oh, lots of hands. Oh no, that's applauses, not hands going up. You can raise your hand. I'm sure they're coming, or you can pop your question in the chat if you don't have video or audio, or if you would rather do it that way. I'm sure.
Kate, do you mind if I just I'm going to go to gallery view because it's quite nice to see the faces at this point. We can go back to the slides if we need to.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to
unshare, and then we can see.
Yeah,
people.
there we go. Yeah.
I'll give people a second to find their hand up button. Billy has his hand up, so we'll start with Billy.
Hi. Sorry, I'm trying to think through my question, but I guess one way of putting it is I'm wondering how far you're going in pushing grammar towards a kind of waste bin and saying, oh, it's not as much of a thing as we think it is. And I thought one way to ask the question might be, when you spoke about, what was it, Peter speaks French fluently. There's a difference between French and English when you play with those adverbs, which is that if you say something like, Peter fluently speaks French, it's way worse for French speakers than it is for English speakers. And the natural assumption is that's because there are different grammars for French and English. But it was beginning to sound like you were saying, nah, it's just following from a load of stuff to do with relevance. But there seems to be a qualitative, intuitional difference between somebody saying something like, I go often to the cinema, as opposed to somebody in French saying, I often go to the cinema. The second one's way worse than French.
So I definitely don't want to put grammar in the wastebasket. People put pragmatics in the wastebasket. I'm trying to pull it out, but that doesn't mean I want to put. Yeah, I don't want to put. I don't want to take that out and put something else back in. Different languages, French, English, whatever. They have different sets of constructions. Those constructions interact with one another in all sorts of different ways. I'm not saying they're irrelevant. Far from it. All that I'm saying is that they are inputs into considerations of relevance. So in the French case, the possibility of being optimally relevant turns on how the various constructions interact with one another, and that's why you will get different intuitions in different cases. Does that answer your question, Billy?
I think it does, yeah. I mean,
okay.
I guess I'm thinking that I want to think about it some more.
Okay, fine.
Look at some more examples of people reacting to things in different ways.
Oh.
But that's good, thank you.
Constant.
Thank you very much for the very, very interesting talk. So yes, you've analyzed acceptability as a plausible optimal relevance, but I'm still wondering what exactly is the target phenomenon of acceptability. Your analysis, I think I understood it quite clearly. And so I wonder whether the target phenomenon can be tested by just asking people if a certain sentence is acceptable in English, if that's a good way to target the phenomenon. And if so, then I wonder what would be the status of a sentence like green IDs sleep furiously, because it seems acceptable to many people intuitively, I guess. I guess that's how Chomsky, why Chomsky chose these examples in the first place. It's because it seems intuitively acceptable before you define technically what grammaticality is. But then it seems also to not be optimally relevant, or it's not plausible that it's optimally relevant in some sense, because it has very low cognitive effects. I mean, what do you learn when you read a sentence? And so, yeah, so I was wondering whether you accepted with this sentence should be acceptable according to how you use the term, and if not, why not? And whether you would consider accept or not, like I do, that this sentence seems not to be so relevant, or is not plausibly optimally relevant. Thank you.
Okay, so it's a great question. I considered addressing it in the talk actually, and it's, I'm still thinking through it, to be honest. You found it over there. Okay. I mean, I can get an almost Pyrrhic victory by pointing out that colorless green ideas sleep furiously obviously can be plausibly can be optimally relevant. You've just used it to be optimally relevant. So you know there is a way in which a great many sentences is not obvious how they're going to be used in an optimally relevant manner, and I don't think you need to intuit how they might plausibly be used. You just need to intuit that they could be used in a plausibly optimally relevant way, and that's how I take sentences like colorless green ideas sleep furiously to be operating. Does that answer your question? It's worth it. I suppose. Let me just really, squeeze what I'm saying down to just a simple contrast. The key criterion is not whether you can plausibly imagine how it could be used, but whether it could be used. I don't need to worry about who's going to do what with it. I have no idea, but someone could do something with this, and the proof that someone could do something with this is the fact that Chomsky did do something enormously important with that sentence.
I guess there's a lot of questions, and we don't have so much. Maybe we can talk about it another times.
Sure. Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, so next person in the hand queue is Robin.
Robin, are you coming?
Looks like I'm unmuted.
Robin, here we are.
Sorry, I was having a lot of very problematic sound at that point. Have I just been asked to ask my question?
Yes, yeah? Robin,
yes.
You're next, sorry.
Sorry, so yes. Oh, goodness, Tom, this is very interesting and very bold, I have to say. I've got quite a lot of things that sort of jump to mind, and I suppose on the basis of what I'm going to be talking about later today, I want to ask you about where lexical innovations and lexical and pragmatic creativity fit into your picture, because one of the big things in relevance theory is ad hoc concept construction, as you know, and recently work by Deirdre and Ingrid on lexical innovations and so on. I mean, so none of these are conventions. In fact, these are they may ultimately introduce new conventions, but they are new when they're produced on the fly and so on, and yet people find them optimally relevant. One of the examples I'm going to use, actually, I'll just read it to you, is and this is from a YouTube comment, if Trump isn't 25th Amendmented in the next 24 hours, then he'll never be removed. And there'll be another terrible incident that he'll get away with. 25th Amendmented here being used as a verb. So, and this is, I think, perfectly acceptable. At least was used and it was understood, and it's been cited here, there, and everywhere. So I just wonder how this sort of thing fits into the picture you're presenting.
Yes. So I touched on, I think, such examples with this slide here. The example you just gave is better than these, actually. The 25th Amendment is great. There are cases where you can use the existing constructions in a language, the words and the more abstract constructions in unconventional ways. That does entail, I assume, additional cognitive effort, but that's fine so long as we can plausibly see some way in which they can deliver some additional cognitive effect. I take that to be the reason why, you can be unconventional, but you can't just be wacky. You can't just, just unconventional in some unconstrained way. 25th Amendmented seems to me to get to this sweet spot of additional cognitive effort, but also additional cognitive effect. And hence it can be optimally relevant, and hence it can be acceptable.
Okay, so, but you did say early on in the piece that, I'm not quite sure how strong you wanted to put it, about conventions are usually the optimally relevant way of speaking, something like that you said.
Yeah. Typically, I mean, I suppose I'm trying to, with that comment, I was trying to explain or deal with the fact that a great deal of what we do say and do is, let's say, grammatical. And I think the reason is not because we're sticking to the rules of a language, but it's because that's the optimally relevant thing to do, is to use the conventions. It's cheap and easy.
Okay. I don't know whether anyone else has got their hand up, because for some reason, I'm unable to see people. I just cannot get the gallery view, unfortunately. So if there are other people who want to speak, I will shut up at this point. If not, I do have another question.
Okay, we have 2 more hands up at the moment, but we have a little bit of time, so maybe we'll come back to you, Rob, in a second. Fabrizio, you're next in the queue, in the line.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
I hope you can hear me. Yeah, thanks for your talk. Mine's just a little remark, I think. I was thinking, just to give you an example in Italian, just to back you up on what you've just said. There's a huge discussion now here on the subjunctive mood. I'm sure that you're familiar with Latin languages and the subjunctive mood that's going out of the window most of the times. But I think, grammatical simplification is quite a normal standard process for languages, isn't it? It's just, I would just want to say that perhaps you can include or say that grammatical competence, it most often is dependent upon your level of education. That's what I was thinking when you were talking. I don't know whether that's relevant at all, but just in the case of the use of the subjunctive mood in Italian, most people would find it odd not to use it. Most people who are educated would find it odd not to use it in the conditional, second type or third type conditional. But I'd say 80 or 90% of the population nowadays wouldn't use it anyway, and so it's optimally relevant not to use it. So I don't know whether it can help at all, making that claim that grammatical competence depends upon your level of education in your argument. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the comment. I don't know if I want to tie anything I've said to level of education. I assume that native speakers all share a great deal of constructions in common. That's what defines a language that's what defines a language. But I do think, what I've described today, I take, it's a manuscript, as I said, but I can see, Robin's already hinted at one, you're hinting at another, all sorts of directions. to go, grammaticalization being a very obvious case, and I might tap you for the details of this Italian example in due course. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Nausicaa.
Thanks for the great talk, Tom. It was very interesting, and as Robin put it, very bold, especially when you come from a department of linguistics. Okay, so I want to kind of follow up on something you said answering to Billy. So you said that all you were saying about grammar and the grammars of different languages is that it might factor in relevance, right? But I got the feeling that at the end of the talk, you were saying something else, and I wanted to kind of press you on that, that maybe that you were also saying that grammar is a kind of construct that would be the result of the use of relevance. Is that right?
Yeah, it's both.
So basically, I suppose even in evolutionary term, we get relevant grammar for free out of relevance.
Yeah, so I think what we've evolved biologically is the capacity for ostensive communication that allows us to, we interact and we communicate, and that generates all sorts of conventions because they're quick and easy ways of doing ostensive communication. And they spiral out into enormous, phenomena of enormous complexity and fascination, which we call languages. And then, they are means of doing the very thing that is at the root of this, which is ostensive communication.
Okay.
So have I answered your question?
No, I think you have. I mean, I was knowing the rest of your work. I was seemed to me a logical step to take, but I was sure you were taking it. And I mean, of course, I'm wondering how you get all sorts of things about grammar and their diversity from there. But that's the main thing I wanted to ask. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left before we want to take a break. So Robin, did you want to come back in?
Okay, yeah, I'd like to discuss further the example, what did Peter eat? Ravioli, and why it isn't acceptable. I don't think it's enough to say, well, there's just not a convention that has been established to allow it. First of all, why isn't there such a convention? We can say, what did Peter eat ravioli with? That's perfectly okay. And in fact, I would say that what did Peter eat ravioli and is perfectly comprehensible as well, but it just hits us as utterly not okay, not grammatical. So why is that on your account? I know you've told us a story, but I just haven't got it really. And I just don't think it's enough to say, well, that's not the conventional way of asking what Peter had with his ravioli.
It's not quite as simple as saying it's just not the conventional way, although obviously I think that feeds in. I'm going back to this slide here, which has the example you're talking about. I think a sentences like this have, they have this particular quality. So they are like this object and like these cows. So, many things in the world I do not perceive as cows, right? So they don't violate my expectations of cows. But there are some things in the world that I immediately perceive as being cows. And then when I look a bit more closely, I wait, hold on, that doesn't work. Ditto for objects. There are certain things in the world I immediately perceive as objects. And then when I look more closely, they don't work. I'm suggesting that there's a certain class of sentences which appear to me, they're presented to me in the world as being ostensive, which means they are optimally relevant. Well, I treat them as optimally relevant. But then when I look more closely, I go, wait, that doesn't quite work. That can't be optimally relevant given the constructions that I know, that are common knowledge that define the English language. So sentences like this have very much in common with these examples from other domains.
Yes, I'm not sure about that analogy actually, but with the particular example, what did Peter eat? Ravioli, and I find that perfectly comprehensible. This one's always
fine.
Ever since I was a student, I thought, gosh, that's really weird. Why isn't that acceptable? You know, it's or grammatical. It's perfectly comprehensible. I know that you want to know what he had with his ravioli, but it hits us in the way that ungrammatical sentences do hit us as just absolutely not okay. And you know, the standard story, I suppose it's to do with certain sorts of locality conditions, which are deep principles of the Chomskyan style grammar, which I think is something you would probably want to reject. But really what you're telling us, I do think you're not telling us about this sentence very much more than that. This is not the conventional way of asking what Peter had with his ravioli. So then my question would be, well, why isn't it the conventional way? Why has this not arisen as a convention?
Yeah, I'm not attempting to answer that question. All I'm attempting to say is the fact that, for whatever reason, which may, you might find solution, very good reasons, true reasons in Chomskyan approaches or in constructionist approaches, whatever those reasons might be, all I want to say is they are inputs into intuitions of possible optimal relevance. They don't themselves, those findings from generative grammar or constructionist grammar, whatever, they do not generate the intuition of unacceptability. They input into the intuition of plausible optimal relevance, which in turn generates the intuition of unacceptability. That's really all I want to say.
Okay.
Okay, Deirdre, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I had lots of questions, but this is actually just a quick follow-up to to two of the examples Robin raised and Tom's response. There's a huge difference, I think, between what did John eat ravioli and Trump was 25th Amendmented. When you think about optimal relevance, and Tom, I think you were using the same response to both, that they weren't optimally relevant. The thing about ravioli and is there is a perfectly acceptable alternative formulation which costs less effort, namely what did he eat ravioli with? So that's why you get an intuition that it's not optimally relevant. In the case of the Trump was 25th Amendmented or whatever it was, there isn't a less costly alternative. It'd have to be Trump was subjected to the 25th Amendment, and that probably costs more effort than the denominal verb 25th Amendmented. So I think if you're using optimal relevance there to explain differences in intuitions, you should be quite careful about examples like the 25th Amendment about denominal verbs, because usually they're the quickest way of getting a meaning across, and the alternative would cost probably more effort. It would involve some paraphrasing. So that was just a thought. My real questions are about FODA, but I won't ask them here, and I'm sure you'll have many answers to them.
I look forward to the questions about FODA, but on the comment, I completely agree, and I think I fear I may have been unclear. So I did not mean to say, I don't know exactly what I did say. I certainly did not mean to say that the 25th Amendment is not optimally relevant.
You said it costs more effort. You said it costs more effort, but you didn't say than.
Okay. I was unclear in my explanation. What I was trying to say is what you just said. I agree with everything you just said.
That's good.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you. There's just to round off, there's a comment in the chat from Anne. I don't know if you can see that, Tom.
She says, I've just got it in front of me.
She says, do you know Donald Davidson's paper, A Nice Derangement of Epitaphs? He makes a distinction between a prior and a passing theory of interpretation that I think lines up quite well with what you were arguing for. Yeah,
I can see it. So I think I read that a very long time ago during my PhD. I will look it up again if I'll look it up again.
So, yeah.
Thank you, Anne, for the suggestion.
So we'll round off this session now. So we're going to be quite strict with time today and try and make sure they get screen breaks and keep things rolling along. Thank you so much, Thom, for your fascinating and stimulating presentation. I'm certainly going to be emailing you with a follow-up question or two. We have a break now of 15 minutes, so we will